Hello everyone, welcome to today's video. We'll be taking a look at a really interesting game that was played on chess.com between none other than Vincent Keymer, the young up-and-coming beast from Germany, and Rosen, your famous YouTube streamer. So let's have a look at how this game played out. We have Vincent with the white pieces. He opens with knight f3, and I won't go into too much detail in the opening phase as it's a relatively quiet English opening that they play, but the middle game absolutely explodes. So let's just quickly go through the opening phase of the game. We have e3, knight f6, c4, e6, knight c3, knight d7, b3. So white is looking for a fianchetto setup with his queenside bishop. Black plays a6, bishop b2 from white, and b6 from black. So black is looking to copy white and go for a queenside fianchetto setup. And now we have an exchange of pawns in the center of the board. And this exchange brings both sides actually some clear direction in terms of how they can use this pawn structure to formulate some middle game strategies. We can see that white now has the half-open C file at his disposal. We'll see what he can potentially muster up there. And black has a half-open E file. So we now have some avenues to proceed with that exchange of central pawns. So whenever you see pawns being exchanged in the center of the board like that, always think about which files are now suddenly half open or completely open and how that might change the course of your strategy. We have g3. So white is looking to create a double fianchetto setup with both of his bishops. Bishop b7, bishop g2, bishop to d6. So both sides are simply completing their development. And now an interesting move from Rosen. He brings out his queen to e7. A bit of a waiting move. Maybe he's just waiting to see which way he goes with his king. If white were to suddenly start throwing Harry up the board, he might think that the king side might not be a great option for his king. So he's trying to keep things somewhat flexible. We see rook to c1, so Vincent bringing his rook onto that half-open file, putting some nice pressure here. And castle's queenside, have a look at this. Some very brave play here from Rosen. He's got his king lined up against that rook on the half-open file, but I guess he's just assessing that he's safe enough there. Look at all the pieces surrounding the black king. He's got essentially his entire army except for the knight and the rook here. So he's got pretty much his entire army surrounding his king, so he must feel very safe there. Is that the case though? How safe is that black king really? Well, let's just find out and see. What does Vincent come up with here? He plays knight to e2, a really interesting strategical maneuver, looking to take advantage of the fact that he hasn't played pawn to d4 yet, which means the d4 square is actually vacant and accessible to his pieces. So by bringing his knight back to e2, he's looking to hop into d4 with his knight. And from d4, it'll have some really interesting attacking possibilities, potentially, hitting squares such as c6, close to the black king, or potentially f5, where it could swing in all sorts of directions. So a really nice maneuver. And I think it's quite instructive that Vincent here relocates his knight from c3 onto d4. I think that a lot of club players would be tempted to move their knight from f3 onto d4, thinking, hey, I'm bringing an extra attacking piece into the vicinity around black's king. Surely it should be correct to move this one to d4, right? Well, the engine does agree with that approach, but I think that the approach that Vincent went with, bringing his knight from c3 to relocate to d4, is actually the more, I guess, like deep and typical maneuver that you'd see a titled player make. He is looking to, for the time being, keep his knight on f3, where it might be playing an important defensive role. If black launches his own kingside attack in the future, that knight on f3 could prove to be very important to defend the white king. Not only that, moving this knight from c3 to e2 has opened up our rook as well. So I thought that it was quite instructive to see which particular knight Vincent decided to hop into d4. He chose his knight from c3. Let's see how the game plays out. Eric moves his king to b8 off that half open file. Seems like a very logical and sensible move to play. And now the knight jumps into d4, already eyeing squares such as f5 and potentially some interesting things on c6 as well. What is Rosen's idea? Where is his counterplay? So Eric goes with bishop to a3. Have a look at this. His idea is to exchange off this piece, thinking that, hey, if we are starting to get under pressure with an attack from white against the black king, let's just exchange some pieces off and we'll reduce the effectiveness of the attack, the more pieces that we trade off. So an interesting try, but as grandmasters do, sometimes when your opponent is making a threat, what do? First, we think about, well, do I really need to respond to that threat? Can I instead proceed with my own plans and kind of just pretend that your move doesn't even do anything? So Vincent plays the move knight to f5. He's not worried about his bishop that is hanging at the moment. He jumps in to f5, striking the queen, striking g7 as well, forcing the queen back essentially to this very passive square on f8. It was a forced move as the queen also has to protect the bishop on a3 as well as this pawn here. So the queen at the moment is sitting in a pretty overloaded state. We see an exchange of bishops. And once again here, Vincent showing his class. A lot of people I know would be very tempted to immediately jump in and snag that loose pawn on g7, but he's not in any hurry. He first plays queen to c2, threatening an absolutely devastating strike here against c7, which has to be dealt with, and then he can pick that pawn up later on at his own leisure. Black plays c5, protecting c7, and now Vincent gobbles on that pawn. We see h5. Rosen is desperately trying to muster up some counterplay, but I mean, if we look at what black can potentially muster up on the king side, it's really not happening here. He's got his rook, he's got the knight, this bishop. Yes, it might potentially become active, but really, what is it going to do? But the biggest tell that people should be able to see from this position that black's attack isn't really generating anything at this stage is because look at this lady here. The black queen is going to have a really hard time effectively trying to relocate herself over to the king side somehow. It's going to be too slow and it will be very easy to keep her out of play. And with the queen essentially out of action from the king side attack here, we can very easily conclude just on first principles that this attack from black is not going to work. Maybe if we magically relocated the queen, somewhere else onto the king side, we might start thinking about possibilities for black. But in this current situation here with the queen offside like this, it's really just hopeful thinking here for black. But he has to do something. It's a blitz game. He has to generate some threats and he just needs to try his luck to see what he can get. Vincent drops back to f5 with his knight, targeting this nice and juicy square d6. And notice if the knight were to land on d6, would be hitting f7 as well, and from f7 would be forking the rooks. So a very, very active pony here from Vincent. We have knight g5 from Eric, and Vincent does indeed jump in with his knight to d6, threatening a pretty nasty fork here. And Eric guards his pawn on f7 by hopping into e5 with his knight. Notice the knight is now guarding f7. Not only that, he has opened up his rook, which is now targeting the loose knight on d6. So Vincent first exchanges knights. Now we have the same configuration. We have a knight defending f7 and we've got a loose knight here on d6. So nothing better for Vincent in that situation other than to exchange off that knight for the bishop. The king recaptures. And in this position here, Vincent plays d4, which is a very good move. But if we come back to this position here, the engine really wanted to play queen to f5 here. Have a look at this queen, hitting the knight, pressuring here, pressuring here. the knight is undefended at this stage, so black needs to do something about it. Let's say, for example, black defends the knight. I mean, he's already dropping h5, but to make matters even worse, have a look at this. White strikes with d4 after the recapture here. The knight is under attack. If the knight, for example, tries to move, we simply take this central pawn here, and look at this. The knight is pinned. We've got two attackers. We can easily pile up with the queen as well. It's just lights out here for black. So queen f5 looked absolutely crushing, but Vincent instead played d4, which was also very strong. We see the knight retreat back, and we have an exchange of pawns. Rosen retakes with his queen. We have an exchange of queens, and now Vincent simply starts gobbling up. Rosen steps up with his king, trying to get himself off that pesky diagonal there, but Vincent continues to mop up now. We have knight to b4, but after rook to f5, hitting more weaknesses here, Eric Rosen resigned the game. And rightly so. We can see from the engine eval that it's sitting at about plus 5.6 for white, so absolutely crushing position. Okay, hope everyone enjoyed that game, but before we wrap up, let's just go back and see where was the critical error in this game. Where did it all go so horribly wrong for Rosen? Because he seemed to play a lot of seemingly logical moves, although in hindsight, castling queenside there probably wasn't the greatest approach. As we can see, the engine really disliked that approach of going queenside with the king. But, it's a blitz game, anything can happen. I'm sure he was trying to spice things up, maybe streaming for his viewers, trying to get an interesting game going with opposite sides castling. So that's okay. Sometimes you just want to play an exciting game of chess, that's fine. So he went queenside. Okay, the engine doesn't like it, but was that really the absolutely fatal decision here? Let's play forward a few more moves. Nice move here from Vincent, looking to relocate that knight. And now it seems that this move here from Eric, bishop to a3, was really when the engine said, okay, there is no going back. The position is essentially busted. So in the game, we saw knight to f5 from Vincent, this in-between move, which was very strong. But have a look at the continuation that the engine really wanted to play here. Something that was even stronger than knight f5 was this one here. Have a look at this. Absolutely incredible. The knight jumps into c6, forking the king and the queen. Absolutely forces the capture from the bishop. Now, we don't recapture the bishop immediately because then we'd lose our bishop here. So first we take the bishop on a3, striking the queen. So forcing recapture. We retake on c6. And now the point is that white can really start putting a lot of pressure on this c file. Have a look at this. Let's say we play something like knight to c5, thinking that we're getting a bit cute here, trapping your rook with the idea of jumping in with the king and just picking up that rook. We simply go d4, hitting that knight. And if you think that you're winning an exchange by stepping up with your king saying, hey, yeah, you can get my knight, but I'll get your rook. Well, it doesn't work that way, unfortunately, because white will instead take on f6, and then he'll grab this guy here. So that doesn't work for black. So instead, if black simply jumps into e4 with his knight, a pretty nice looking configuration, black might be, happy with his position here. The point is that after queen c2, we've already got pressure here, but we're going to triple up here. We've almost got an Alekine's gun. We're going to be tripled up on the c file. There is really no logical way to keep c7 under wraps. Have a look at this. We are already pressuring c7. So let's say black tries to guard it. We jump in with our knight, kick the rook back, and now we just triple up. Rook c1. Have a look at this. All the heavy pieces against c7. If black tries to hang on for dear life to that pawn, no, you can't do that because we simply take this guy here and you can't recapture because your rook would be hanging. So some really interesting stuff here with the immediate knight to c6 instead of knight f5 that Vincent played, striking the queen, which was also very strong. Instead, jumping into c6. And the point was that essentially we just have too much pressure down the c file. Absolutely incredible. It's just unstoppable that white is essentially gonna just pile up on the c file and just crash through. So a really instructive sequence there, starting with the immediate knight to c6. And because of that possibility of the knight sinking itself into c6 and all this pressure with the heavy pieces along that c file, the computer really wanted to play the immediate c5 and just say, okay, we're not going down any of those paths. You're not infiltrating onto c7. I'm pushing up with c5. That's the end of that. Playing c5 right now would have just walked into knight f5. White would have picked up the bishop pair. Let's say, for example, after queen to e6, would take the bishop, would play d4. And this is an absolutely dominating position here for white. Okay, so there we have it. A very interesting game. I hope that everyone enjoyed the analysis there. A really interesting attacking game with opposite sides castling, and white managed to crash through in the center. I hope everyone enjoyed that.